What else is going on? So I got
I haven't really been in touch with Dan much. Jim sent my email about the Mets and other baseball things, which is kind of nice. Dan, a couple of years ago, I got an email from him that I had a story in the Times on James Brown. He emailed me to say that I wanted to do something like it himself, but
I just sent you a text. I'm going to come home tomorrow, start traffic when I come back. Oh, definitely.
you mind? I can sit up there if you want. Marsha, do you know?
But I'm not sure. Just stay with Debbie and yes, they moved to
You know what?
so then I'm staying up there.
Because he lives in
Can't get behind that. That sounds so good.
I got in touch with him.
he was on my email. I think he got my email.
You are, you can't help it. I'll talk to you later.
He's Harvey, a very good friend. I mean, it's best. It's the best. The place is news section.
We'll go to Star Trek.
Oh, great. At least they still cover sports.
Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. We've got this running on YouTube, and people are waiting to see it. And so,
You didn't have to sit through all that traffic?
Are you
Thanks, Susan.
That's part of the fun.
Oh, yeah, fun.
It's so fun. Welcome to Watching Booksellers, to the Kids Room. Thank you all for being here tonight. We're sorry Margot couldn't be here tonight. She and Susan go way, way back, and she's a dear friend, and she wanted to be here, but that's part of the reason we're YouTubing, so I would say hi, Margot. I'm going to give a quick introduction, and then let these two get to talking about Paper of Wreckage. Susan Mulcahy started at the New York Post as a copy girl while still in college. She worked at Page 6 from 1978 to 1985, including 3 years as editor before moving to Newsday to write a rival column. She has also written for The New Yorker and The New York Times and has published 3 previous books, including a memoir about Page 6. And with her tonight, her conversation partner is Harvey Arrington. He is a longtime New York sports journalist whose career spanned 4 newspapers: the Staten Island Advance, New York Post, Daily News, and New York Times, where he was a Sports of the Times columnist and also wrote for other sections. He was nominated by the Times for a Pulitzer Prize in 1994 and was inducted into the media wing of the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame in 2017. He is the author or co-author of 8 nonfiction books and 1 novel, and has taught media courses at Montclair State University. And he's also going to be on our podcast in, I think, 2 weeks. So go to the Watching Booksellers podcast and listen to Harvey so far. So welcome to the club.
I didn't win the closet. It was rigged. But I did read this wonderful book, and thank you all for coming out to hear about paper wreckage. I read it over the last couple of weeks, and of course I read parts that I was involved in first. But it is just a terrific book. I consider it like an uproarious history of New York of the last 45 to 50 years, so from the time Rupert Murdoch purchased the Post. Let me start by just asking you, Susan, this is a massive undertaking, obviously. Countless people that you interviewed, chased after. What made you and Frank DiGiacomo, who's Susan's co-author, want to do this?
Well, I had been thinking a lot about the Post. I left New York for 10 years and came back probably about 20 years ago, and just being back in the city over the years, reading the Post again, and then in the last 5, 6, 7 years, something like that, I wrote a piece about covering Trump for Politico. I did a piece about Myron Mushetsky, who's here, and is the leader of Post Nation for the New Yorker. I just started thinking a lot about the Post, and people were telling me more outrageous stories than I'd even heard in the past. And I was having lunch with a friend of mine who said, this would make a great oral history. Dan Flores, he had just done an oral history on basketball. And I mentioned it to, I knew I would need a co-author because it would be massive, and it was. I mean, it is. We interviewed more than 240 people, and Frank said he would definitely be interested, and he was the perfect collaborator because he had done a big oral history for about page 6 for Vanity Fair in 2004. And he interviewed a lot of people who have since passed away, like Jim Brady, Claudia Cohen, Steve Dunleavy, and we were able to use excerpts of those interviews, some of which never appeared in Vanity Fair. But anyway, the time also seemed right. The election, the next election was approaching. And it just seemed like the right time to do it. Also, the Post has been remarkably influential and has basically created the media culture that we live in now. This very divisive, everybody yelling, and in some ways, listen, I'm more in tune with MSNBC than I am with Fox News, but there's a little bit of similarity with the two of them. They're both speaking to the converted, let's put it that way. Although I think there are a few more facts on MSNBC. Anyway, so that the time seemed right. And getting to all these people, we tried a lot of people who turned us down. Like, I interviewed you, and also Pete, people who follow sports, Pete Vesey was also a major basketball columnist. And so I had this list of names of all these players that I wanted to get to talk to us, and you two had mentioned. The only one I got, but it was a good one, was Bill Bradley. But everybody else, I never heard from these people. I think people don't want to piss off the Post. If they say anything negative, they're afraid, because the Post, when they go after somebody, they put their fangs in and they don't let go until the beast is dead. They really go after people.
Yeah. So Murdoch buys the Post in '76.
Right.
Now, as a kid who grew up in New York City, outer boroughs, sports fan, my dad brought the Post home every day. When he'd get home around 5:30, 6 o'clock, I would be running to the front door of our apartment, not to necessarily greet him, but just pull the Post out of his back pocket. What exactly in '76, when Rupert bought the Post, what did he get?
He got this genteel, liberal afternoon newspaper that was very feature-oriented because it was afternoon, it wasn't breaking. And it had a largely Jewish audience and a Jewish focus, really. Actually, Danny Fields is manages a lot of rock stars. He called it News for Jews. And it was very like Bill Bradley talked about how much he respected it, because even though it was aimed at mostly, I think, a blue-collar audience in those days, it had these very high-minded liberal columnists like Murray Kennedy. So that's what he was buying, and it was dying. Dorothy Schiff, who was heir to a banking fortune, had owned it since 1939, and it had been profitable, not in a major way, but all of a sudden, this was the first year that it was losing money, and she was decided to sell it. She just couldn't deal with it, even though she had a banking fortune. Banking fortunes are not bottomless pit. So.
And the Post also had a rich crusading history.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Exactly.
Buckyism, do all that. So Murdoch early on, there was one story that included pretty early in the book.
Cheryl Benson, is that her name? Did I get that right?
Yes.
She's in Washington DC on assignment when all of a sudden Islamic terrorists take over 3 buildings, if I'm recalling correctly,
Yeah.
kill a couple of people, and are holding, I don't know, more than 100 people hostage, right? Tell us what happens from there.
Well, they sent her, this happened in the spring of '77, and Murdoch bought the paper in late '76 and took over in early '77. So Cheryl was sent to the scene to try and get quotes, and she basically told the desk editors, like, I can't get anything. This major crisis is happening with the hostages and nobody's talking. And she sees the paper the next day, and there's this story in there with all these quotes that has her name on it, and she didn't write it, and she didn't get the quotes. So she went in and quit as soon as she got back to New York.
So you get a sense, I think also in that story, one of the editors who was working on that, remember the Post is an afternoon paper, so it's not like the Times or the Daily News, which is getting put together, you know, in the evening, maybe the latest edition is rolling at 12:30. When I was covering Knicks of the Post in the late 70s, early 80s, I'd go down from the garden, go to the office, load up on coffee, and sit there and write all night. The paper didn't lock up until early in the morning. So somebody wrote, one of the editors was quoted in the book as saying that when the story was totally rewritten, there was one special guy who came in at 3 o'clock in the morning, rolled up his shirt sleeves, had suspenders on, and totally rewrote the story, made up quotes, wrote the headline, "We'll behead them," right?
Yeah.
Who was that?
Mr. Murdoch, I
Mr.
believe.
Murdoch.
So, no, he was running the paper. He was, back with the early days of his ownership of the paper, he was in the newsroom a lot, he wrote a lot of the headlines.
So this is very different from your average publisher. This was a guy, whatever you think of him, who loved newspapers, loved newsprint,
Right.
right? And really wanted to be in on the action. So as you begin to undertake this project, but also knowing, you know, we have the benefit of history, where he's gone politically, ideologically, with not only the Post but Fox News. How do you go about portraying him in some fair-minded way? I mean, he has had, as you mentioned earlier, a significant impact on the culture, the media culture. So what did you set out to do in portraying this guy who's still current, he's still involved in our lives?
Well, you know, we ended up with a far more, I won't say that it's entirely positive portrayal of him, but I have a very negative personal opinion of Murdoch, given the damage that he's caused. But so many people that might not agree with him ideologically really respected a lot of things about him, especially the fact that he works really hard. He'll come in, roll up his shirt sleeves, and run the desk, especially early on. And he had worked as a newspaper editor briefly on Fleet Street after he got out of college. So he actually knew how to, scale it. He knew how to lay things out and how to edit. So he was much more hands-on than a lot of people who own newspapers are. So
Yeah, so, the aggressiveness of the Post, I think all of us who work there, in some way, found some of the tactics repugnant, right?
right.
I had basketball players who wanted to kill me, walking into the gym, and the back page of the Post, had whatever. But there was also this aggression that I don't think the Daily News had.
No.
And most people who worked at both papers would agree. So there are many stories in this book, and another one that stood out to me was involved Anne, I don't want to pronounce her name right, is it Bollinger? Bollinger. And Oliver North. Could you tell that story? Because I
Yeah.
thought that was amazing. I
Yeah,
didn't know that.
this is the Post would go about getting stories in ways that were completely unethical, like Steve Dunleavy masquerading as a grief counselor to get an exclusive interview with the mother of a victim of Son of Sam, you know, that kind of thing. But this woman, Ann Bollinger, everybody wanted to get an interview with Oliver North. So she is sent down, she's there with like a zillion other press people. This is going during the Iran-Contra hearings, and she can't get anywhere, and she comes up with this really good idea, which is she's gonna interview the guys that are guarding him, these special agents that are protecting him because he's, you know, being threatened, etc. And she does a big piece in the paper, and the next day, Al Ellenberg, who was her editor, said, she still couldn't get, even after doing this, still couldn't get the interview. He said, okay, when the motorcade pulls out with him in it to take him to church, when his car comes out, not a motorcade, just his car, go stand in front of the car. And she's like, I'm gonna get arrested. He said, just go stand in front of the car. So she stands in front of the car, and these guys that she's just interviewed are, Anne, you have to move, we're gonna have to arrest you. And they pull her to the side, and the window of the car goes down, and Oliver North is reading the article in the New York Post, and said, did you write this? She said, yes. He says, get in. And spent the day with him and his family, went to church. She did nothing unethical, but she did something very creative, and she got this great exclusive story that a zillion other reporters were hanging out waiting to get.
Yeah, that was the thing, there was somebody else who was quoted in the book as saying, every assignment I was sent on, I had a pit in the middle of my stomach, because you understood that, you know, you better not call up and say, I don't have anything, right? And I remember when Greg Gallo walked over to me, I was working day rewrite, and he walked over to me and said, hey, you know, George Steinbrenner, this guy Al Rosen is no longer the general manager, right? We need to get George on the phone. And so I'm sitting there saying, George doesn't know me, I was like 24 years old. But I called George's office, the shipbuilding company down in Tampa, and I said to the secretary, Harvey Arakon from the New York Post called for Mr. Steinbrenner. A minute later she comes back, he's not here. So I'm sitting there with the phone in my ear, and I'm afraid to like put it down and go tell Greg that, who was a sports editor, I can't get him. So I had an idea, and there was a guy named Mickey Morabito who was the PR director for the Yankees, and I called up again, the secretary answered, and I said, hi, this is Mickey, I need George. And George comes on the phone, and I say, Mr. Steinbrenner, it's not Mickey, it's Harvey Arakon. And he like yelled at me for like 30 seconds, and then he said, but I like your spunk. And he gave me a generic quote, but I got my quote. Let's talk about the front page, because, you know, the wood is what it's known as, is, you know, standard to any discussion in the Post, and standard to any discussion of the Post on the front page is the headline that you hear about all the time, that, you know, has been memorialized, headless body and topless part. What I really loved about this book is that Susan didn't just make it an oral history. There are a lot of people, we didn't mention this earlier, quoted in the book who didn't work for the Post. These are people who were entrapped by the Post at one stage or another, or had some kind of association, but they're all there in the book as well. So tell us about the reporting that you did to get behind the story of that legendary headline.
So headless body and topless bar, everybody knows this. They know the headline, but the story behind it is so gruesome and so horrendous that I became obsessed with finding the people who could give me all the details, which turned out to be the assistant district attorney in Queens who tried the case, and the cop who arrested the murderer and the beheader and the rapist and the kidnapper. So I filed FOIL requests. I went to all this trouble to try and, I knew who the two people were I was looking for. Well, I didn't have the name of the ADA. Anyway, we ended up finding him. My collaborator, Frank DiGiacomo, had done an interview with Governor Patterson, who had worked in the Queens DA's office, and I couldn't get the name, so I finally said, hey, ask Patterson if he knows it. So he did not know the name, but he gave me the name of a guy in the DA office who'd been there for, 40 years. So I kept leaving him messages, and I thought, this guy is never gonna call me back. And literally, maybe 2 months after I called him, I got this call from the Queen's DA's office, and he gives me the name of Peter Dunn, who tried the case. And the story is, I'll give you the brief and less gruesome version. Well, it's pretty gruesome no matter how you say it. There was a bar called Hervey's Bar and a guy named Charlie Dingle came in, got into his drunk, high, whatever, gets into an argument with the owner, shoots him in the head, kills him, this is Herbie, throws out most of the patrons except for a topless dancer, Herbie's wife, and another woman. And then he rapes the dancer. Then there's a knock on the door, and it turns out to be Herbie's niece, who is a mortician, which he discovers by looking through her purse. Decides he wants to get the bullet out of the head so it won't be traced to him. So this poor woman has to, with a steak knife, try and get the bullet out of her uncle's head. Then he says, forget it, let's just take the head off. So she had, anyway, so the head ends up, then he says he wants the women to drive him to the East River where he's gonna throw the head in the East River. He puts it in an almond wine box filled with leftover New Year's Eve decorations. He falls asleep in the car while they're driving to the East River, so they go into Manhattan. They park near 168th and Broadway. Why they didn't go into Columbia Presbyterian, nobody knows. That's the cop, and at this point, I've also found the cop, who was in Florida. And I talked to him, and he says, yeah, they went into the subway station, they sent him, they didn't believe him, so they sent him down to the transit cop at 59th Street. Anyway, it goes on and on. But he goes back with the mortician, and they find the guy sitting in the back of the car, and he's fallen asleep, wakes up, reaches for his gun. Anyway, this is the most gruesome part. So, the cop, Fred Matt, who now lives in Florida, which I think all retired cops live in Florida. But anyway, he says calls up, he doesn't believe the women either. So he calls the Queens precinct where the bar is located, and the cop that answers says, have you got the head? Because at that point, this gypsy cab driver whose car they stole to get into Manhattan was locked in the bathroom. He broke out, he called the cops. The cops came, they find the body with no head. So when Fred hears, do you have the head? He believes the woman, they go, they get the guy, arrest him. Then Fred has to go to the funeral home where where Herbie, the bar owner, is being laid up because no one has identified the body, they just identified the head. And the owner of the funeral home has used a 2x4 to put the head and the body back together because it was an open casket.
No.
So when people
Susan,
think
you buried the lead.
I buried the lead, exactly. Henry's Body and Cop with Scars is really funny. It's not that funny.
How is this not a Netflix series? I mean, so that's the front of the paper. We all know about that. But there are other sections in the Post. I think Billy, you would agree, Myron, you would agree, that sports being one of them, from pre-Murdoch to right now, that still has a lot of love and respect around the country. In fact, the Post as a website is doing quite well, and it's still employed. It's one of the few newspapers that really, aside from the Times and the Wall Street Journal, and a couple of others, that hasn't basically laid off half its staff. The Post still has a more than ample sports section, spends a lot of money, sends the reporters everywhere. And all of us, Frank Isola is here, who have worked there, have some pride about that. But the same could be said for the media section, the business section, the arts section. It had upscale readership. Long after Murdoch took the Post downscale, people would still buy it on the trains going home in the afternoon, which is a perfect segue into page 6, right? Because page 6 is an institution, right? You were there early on. Tell us about the challenges, not only in working a page like that had enormous influence and power, but also, you were fighting to keep it from being labeled gossip, because it was much more than that. Tell us about that.
Yeah, no, it really wasn't a gossip column because everything, the Post may have played fast and loose with facts in other parts of the paper, but page 6 became very popular very quickly. It launched the day Murdoch's first paper was January 3rd, 1977, and that was the first page 6. And from the start, they really wanted it to be accurate. So we also, the people that were working on it were mostly, Jim Brady was the editor for a couple of years and he actually created it and he was not a baby boomer, but a lot of the people that worked there were baby boomers. We came of age during, the Watergate hearings and we all wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein, so we didn't want to, so we took it very seriously. And after a while it got to be so popular, you could get people to talk to you, you could get information. They might not return your call quickly if they didn't want the information on page 6, but so many people wanted to be on page 6 that it wasn't as tough as I think it might have been had it been completely inaccurate. But it really, after a while I became resentful of the gossip label because it wasn't gossip. And it's funny when you were talking about the sports section, when I interviewed Greg Gallo, I talked about what people's experience was as the Post got more and more outrageous and they would tell people they worked there. And Greg said, he'd say, I work at the Post, and they'd go, ooh. And then, in what department? Sports. Oh, sports. Yeah. So it's kind of, and if I said page 6, sometimes I still get, ooh, and people thought maybe I was like writing down what they were saying, but it was, they did not pay. The interesting thing about the Australians and the Brits that were most of the editors, all these editors that Murdoch brought over, was sometimes they were super smart about what worked in the Post, and at other times they were just completely clueless. Like when Bright Lights Big City came out, which is like 83, 84, they had realized they had this younger Wall Street crowd that were really getting into the Post because they loved the sports, they loved the crazy front pages, they liked the high-low mix, and I forget which one of the Australians, but he said, should we excerpt that? And I'm like, oh, no, what a bad idea. I said, pick like Tammy Wynette's autobiography, do something, excerpt a book that's very tabloidy. Like they didn't know which sections, they didn't know how the mix should flow sometimes.
Yeah, and a lot of people in the book say, upscale people, that it was their guilty pleasure for the Post. And I remember when I was in the Post, when Daily News came out with Daily News Tonight, they were going to start their own afternoon paper to try to knock the Post out. And we all said, oh God, we're dead, they've got all this money. And it came out and it was all featurey and, long stuff jumping all over the place. It died after a year.
Right.
Because they misunderstood that whether you're an attorney or a Wall Street person, after being under pressure all day long, you just wanted to get on the train and read Peter Bessie's basketball notes column on page 6. Right. You didn't want to read 2,000 words about the Georgia football team or something like that. So, but speaking of people who wanted to be on page 6, a guy currently running for president was one of them. What was that like dealing with him? Because you talk about that in the book.
Yeah. Well, he never. We did a reading last week in Manhattan, and someone said, I heard the 3 people that called you every day were Donald Trump, Roy Cohn, and Tim Russert. And I said, I didn't answer it properly because Donald Trump never called me once. I mean, I called his office multiple times to fact check things about him and find out whether or not they were true. And with 100%, every single time he lied. So, and I just got sick of writing about him because he was such a liar. I should have banned him from the page, but you have those days when you're kind of desperate and you need 2 more little holes to fill. And some PR guy that you like calls you and is like, can you do me a favor? And he's done you a favor, and the next thing you know, it's a Donald Trump item.
By the way, that's been the mainstream media for the last 9 years.
Exactly. Well, he's been very smart about his PR over the years, who he hires, and but he never, this whole fake spokesman, this guy John Barron, he pretends to be and calls reporters. I never dealt with that. Also, early on when I was working on page 6 as a clerk and then the reporter, Trump was legitimately doing some major real estate deals. I think he had so many failures that after a while, he did become less serious, let's put it that way. But at the beginning, he definitely was involved in some major deals. So, and real estate people kind of run the city. So and page 6 was all about power and behind the scenes, and we wrote about, like, political consultants became stars on page 6, even more so than the politicians they worked with. And we wrote about Wall Street people and the kind of, quote, celebrities that really hadn't been written about in that way before.
So I have a couple more questions before we open it up to millions. You mentioned the Aussies and the Brits, and of course the most notorious of all the characters that Murdoch brought over was Steve Dunleavy, right? And I have this vague memory of getting to the Post as a clerk in 1977, and that summer was Son of Sam, and I just remember, you know, when Berkowitz wrote to Jimmy Breslin at the Daily News, and Breslin put it in the paper, that Steve was kind of like pleading with Son of Sam in the Post, don't write to him, I'll give you a better play. How would you characterize Steve Dunleavy and his influence on that place for quite a few years?
Oh, yeah, yeah, he would do anything for a story. He would, you know, murder his mother for a story. And he was so competitive. And a lot of people, I would say a majority of people who dealt with him found him charming. I say they found him charming. I didn't say I found him charming. Anyway, he was very entertaining, he was very outrageous, he drank, everybody drank a lot, but no one had ever seen anyone consume alcohol like Dunleavy. And his influence was such that, I mean, Hal Davis was the state Supreme Court reporter, and I had so much respect for Hal. He could have worked at the Times, he could have worked anywhere, he's an amazing reporter. And he said Dunleavy was one of the best editors. He had two great editors that he worked for in his career, and Dunleavy was one of them. And sometimes Dunleavy would have him doing these crazy bullshit things that he knew would never turn into a story, but that often Dunleavy had really good ideas and really good instincts for what worked in a tabloid. Murdoch there was another editor, named Kelvin Mackenzie, who was very briefly at the Post in the late 70s and went back to London and eventually became a long-running editor of The Sun in London, which is Murdoch's big tabloid there. And he and Steve, another British editor, Dave Banks, said they were like the illegitimate twins Murdoch never had. And Murdoch just loved them. They were both completely outrageous, politically incorrect, would say or do anything, would tweak a story to make the wood more outrageous, and that's what Murdoch liked.
It was very interesting in those early days because you had these two shadow staffs. I mean, you had all these, Anna Quinlan, Maggie Haberman was there at one time, Murray Kempton, Jim Wetzler, all these, real serious journalists, many of whom wound up at the Times or other places.
Right.
And then you have the Fleet Street mob and the Aussie mob coming in, and it was fun watching it kind of coexist. What would you say is the legacy to this point of the Post?
I think the legacy, unfortunately, is pretty negative because the way the Post operates, first of all, after the Post came A Current Affair, which was the first of the tabloid TV shows that led to like a dozen other tabloid TV shows. And the way those stories were put together influenced his news stations when he bought them. And I just think that Fox News is at the apex of the media culture that he has created, and we see where we are today. So unfortunately, I think the legacy is not all that positive. But there are positive things to be said. I still read the Post every day. I ignore the national political coverage, but there's a lot of terrific material in the Post. It's just unfortunate that.
One last thing about Dunleavy. It's pretty stunning when I read that he somehow, I think it was the last woman who was killed by Son of Sam, and he posed as a hospital
grief counselor
to get in to interview the young woman's mother.
Well, and we think, I'm pretty sure enough people said, yeah, and he had an affair with her. And because, hey, whatever needs to be done for the story. But she would come into the office, he'd send her flowers, he'd take her out to lunch. Did he have an affair? We don't have proof, but that was intimated. Yes.
So, last question, does the Post, in your opinion, survive post-Rupert?
I hope it does, but I am very skeptical because I don't think the kids are all that attached to. His work ethic is one positive thing about Murdoch, and the other thing is that he loves newspapers. And very few people these days really feel that attached to, especially print newspapers. And I don't know, I don't think, even if I'm sure, maybe some of you have read about this battle that's going on in the courts over whether or not the trust that his 4 kids have that will control his empire once he's gone. He wants to change things and have it all be Lachlan, who's more aligned politically with him than anybody else. So, but even if that doesn't happen, I don't think the other 3 kids are all that attached to newspapers either.
Yeah, what's going on in, I think it's in Reno, in this special hearing, it's really succession. I mean,
Exactly.
That's where they got the TV series from. It's real life, and so much is similar. 4 kids,
Right.
you know, and they're all fighting, you know, for control. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. So let's open it up to some questions.
Just a quick one. Did you try to get Rupert Murdoch to talk? And
Yeah, and you know, a friend of mine has dealt with his office, and she had we didn't get through the PR people at first, we went to his secretary, and she didn't say no right away, so we were very hopeful for a couple of months, and then once I got a call from the PR person, I thought, well, that's the end of that. So we did try. And we tried the kids too, and nothing, so.
Someone had their hand up in the back?
Yeah,
Sir?
thanks, Harvey. I just wanted to echo something that you said because I worked there on the business desk copy editor from 2011 to 2022. And before the Daily Mail guy, Keith Poole, came in, which was 5 years ago, I mean, when Cole Allen left, you know, that's a whole separate, you know, escapade there. There was kind of a year or 2 gap where we just kind of like, you know, just played it by ear, and then he brought in this new guy there. But prior to that, you know, at least on the business desk, and I'm saying this because you said there were other parts of the paper, like the arts and the sports and the business, that were well regarded. We never made stuff up. We never made stuff up. You know, occasionally there were some business columnists that went a little, you know, little wackadoodle there. But as far as the investigative stuff, the hard news stuff, it was for that, until that time that he took over, you know, from the Daily Mail and decimated the business section and made everything sort of like slanted. You know, if Elon Musk wanted a story that, or you know, his point of view, Keith Poole would just pick up the phone and talk to the business editor. Don't you like what what Elon Musk just said? And I only bring this up because, you know, for the time that I worked there, for the most part, except for, you know, some of the political stuff, which was kind of wacky, right? But like what you said, there was some terrific stuff in there.
Yeah, no,
You know, some reporters that did great jobs, and it would crush me to pick up the paper when I came in the office that day and see, you know, really wackadoodle head or some crazy story on page 3 or page 5, when all the other stuff was good.
Yeah, no, it's one guy that I interviewed, Nick Vega. He was a young guy that worked as a tech reporter there for a few years. He grew up on the Upper West Side, and he'd have all these people in his family texting and saying, "What is going on down there? Did you see that story?" He's like, "I work in the business section. You know, I'm just doing what I've been assigned to do. I have nothing to do with that part of the paper." But I think it became very uncomfortable. Mackenzie Dawson, who was the books editor, said that it became a challenge. Authors started refusing to be in the paper, which was really a problem for them because they had a very good book section. You were part of that, Billy, right? Yeah, she said it really became a problem.
Question? Dave?
Susan, I worked at the Daily News with Harvey and Philip, and it was a very ferocious competition between the News and the Post, the tabloid wars, if you will. I think the Post, you referred to us as the Daily Snooze. But after the bankruptcy and the strike at the Daily News, Mark Zuckerman took over, and he was obsessed with the Post. He brought in posties, he brought in people, he brought in some Fleet Street people. Do you think Murdoch was ever affected by this obsession, or did it get on his radar at all?
Well, at that point, Murdoch didn't own the paper because he didn't own it from. He had to sell it in '88 and he bought it back in '93. But after he brought it back, there was, I forget what Joanne Wasserman, who is one of the editors of Page 6 at that time, they declared like a ceasefire. And the gossip columnists at the Daily News were told, you cannot write about Murdoch. And the Page Six people were told, you cannot write about Mort Zuckerman, I don't care what they, so it was like, they, I guess, is that an obsession with each other? Sort of, but they decided they weren't gonna be constantly striking at each other, at least in the gossip columns. Yeah.
You mentioned that you still read, you still enjoy it every day, but you don't read the news or the opinion.
Well, I do read, I shouldn't say I never read it, I read it sometimes, and if it totally pisses me off, I don't finish it.
Well, and that's kind of my question is, do you not, when you avoid it, is it because it's such a right-leaning point of view that you find some of it to just be, objectionable? Or do you feel like it's not true? Like,
Well,
because like this story the other day with the FEMA not, the cover story was that FEMA's not, that they're neglecting people because of migrant loans.
Right.
That just wasn't true.
Mhm.
Is that why you wouldn't read it, or is it more the point of view?
No, I mean, if people have a conservative point of view, they're entitled to their point of view. What bothers me is when it is not accurate. There's a columnist named Miranda Devine, whose father actually was the editor of the Post. He was a really good, I didn't work directly with him, but he actually tried to hire me back after I left Page Six. And he's a very nice guy, very well respected by people at the Post. And this is his daughter. And there's a guy that she's written about, I did a search at least 3 or 4 times. She uses him as an expert. His name is Albert Marco. And she sometimes says he's a pollster, then she says he's a financial consultant, and So I called a couple of political consultants I know and said, have you heard of this guy? Nobody'd heard of him. And then I actually called Frank, or emailed Frank Luntz, who's a well-known Republican pollster. He never heard of him. And this is, he does exist. I've looked him up. He exists, but he is not, from what I can tell, what she says he is. He's basically there to, so that sort of thing I find very frustrating and annoying. And also they will print stuff that is inaccurate in terms of the way the government is handling things. So, if it's not Donald Trump's government. So, yeah. I don't know if I quite answered your question.
No, you did. And that's because my company works with them, and I love the paper.
Yeah.
But I struggle when it's just not true. Like,
Well,
I kind of feel like there are pillars of journalism as a former journalist where you feel like those who are the respected places, you expect more.
yeah, and that is, and I think the Post could be a great newspaper again if they could still be conservative, but if they didn't bend so far in a way that is sometimes or often inaccurate, then they could still have a conservative viewpoint and be a well-respected paper again. It's frustrating because it does have this really amazing history. In the 50s, when Jimmy Wexler, who stayed on when Murdoch bought it because he was an older man at that time and probably would have had a hard time getting another job, he did all these groundbreaking investigations into McCarthy and Walter Winchell and Robert Moses. He's all over the power broker. Jimmy Wexler / Dolly Schiff Post figures prominently in the power broker because they were the first ones to do a lot of the stories that that he ended up expanding on for the book. Yeah, so it's a shame. It has a really storied history, but it's still around. Look at all the papers. That's the thing, and it employs people. So
It's also sort of a fascinating result, not completely resolved, but where the war between the Daily News and the Post
the Post has won.
has won. I mean, it was bitter, and there were people jumping back and forth. And I went from the Post to the Daily News in 1982 or 3.
Harvey, you have to tell the story of what Jerry Lisker told you when you told him you were
Okay,
going.
so Fred Gallo was the de facto sports editor. Jerry Lisker was the official sports editor. Jerry was a lunatic. He would show up, to boxing matches with chains and his shirt unbuttoned down to his navel, and he was just a figurehead, but he was an affectionate guy. I mean, he was hard to dislike him. But all right, so the Daily News calls me up and offers me a job covering its basketball beat, and they say to me, great, and I go back and I say, hey, I have an offer to go to the Daily News, and it's maybe $50 or $75 a week more, which is decent for that time. And I told Jerry and Greg, can we talk? And and Jerry said, and Greg says, yeah, Jerry says, meet us at Marie's, which was this mob bar right behind the building. You couldn't, the windows were darkened, I mean.
There were no windows.
There were no windows, it was just like this, like, I don't even know how it existed, but, so I meet them there, and Greg's sitting there, and I come in, and Jerry, and I said, where's Jerry? He'll be here in a second. Jerry storms in, and he says, and I'm gonna say something that is, politically incorrect, because of what Jerry came in and told me. He comes in with a scowl on his face, and he says, I'm gonna give you 3 reasons why you can't go to the Daily News. Number 1, they're gonna fold in 6 months, right? Which I suppose there would be no reason for 2 and 3. Number 2, they hate Jews. Right? And actually, when I got there, not a lot of people, but there were some. And number 3, that sports editor who's offering you the job, a guy named Gene Williams, he's a fag. And with that, Jerry got up and left. And Greg Gallo looks at me and goes, there you go. Went home, called up the Daily News and said, I'm coming. But that was Jerry. I mean, he was totally out of his mind.
It was really, you had a great description of him. Harvey said he was like a character out of a Tarantino film. Like how he became a sports editor is beyond me. But he worked at the Daily News actually before. He was not an Australian because Murdoch didn't really know American sports. But he knew he needed a certain type of sports editor, and it worked.
There's a story in the late 70s, the Times hired a female sports editor. Her name is Leanne Schreiber, and she was making the rounds to various sports events, and she went to a Madison Square Garden boxing match, right? And here comes Jerry in his chains and his dark clothes and his tan, and he always had tan. And he comes over scowling, and he says a couple of things, and then walks away. And Leanne says to the other guy who was standing there, "Who's that?" And the guy said, "That's your competition sports editor." Any other questions, Myron?
Actually, talking about the competition between the Post and the Daily News, I remember seeing there was a time when, the Post is at 1211 Avenue Americas, Rockefeller Center, there's a big plaza in front, and the Daily News, in the afternoon, they had a guy with a Daily News newspapers rack in front of the Post building selling copies of the Daily News. He had the Daily News cap, he had the newspaper rack, an umbrella, and he's standing in front of the Post building selling copies of the Daily News. So the Post sent their own guy next to him with a New York Post newspaper rack, umbrella, and the two of them are selling the papers. And whenever I would see them, they're chatting away, and I pictured that when they were both finished, they probably went to some bar and pounded a few beers.
Well, it was still pretty competitive. Maybe not in the sales department, but in other ways.
Phil?
When you were interviewing these people, I mean, the Post was famously for years and years hemorrhaging money. At least that was the impression that we got, tens of millions of dollars. Did any of them feel that pressure from above, or was that just assumed it was okay all along?
Well, the Post was not a profligate spender that I recall. I mean, they did spend on certain things like, sports. They made sure they covered everything. That didn't really come up. And when I worked there, we didn't spend a ton of money, and we had expense accounts, but they were not super generous. So also the unions were much stronger then. So if you were going to have a paper and you had a newspaper guild, etc., although the newspaper guild's power diminished as the years went on, and then he broke the union entirely in '93. But that it didn't come up with people, that they felt pressure not to spend a lot of money.
And don't you think that to a certain extent, he understood the benefit of owning the Post? I mean, he could, whisper in a politician's ear,
Right.
saying, you have a choice. you can play ball with us and pass legislation like, you know, FCC stuff and, you can have a book deal at HarperCollins, right? Or we can have Page 6 torture you, you know, or the rest of the paper torture you in front of the paper, for the next 5 years. And I think he got that, the Post gave him a lot of leverage.
Oh, no, it has been losing, one person that we interviewed, Chris Ruddy, who founded Newsmax, which is the competition for, Fox News, he estimates it's over $1 billion in real money that Murdoch has lost on the Post, but it's been the funnel that, you know, it's led to everything else. And it's given him political power, even, the Post political power has diminished, but it's still there. I mean, it covers the city. And, I mean, it's not that the Times doesn't cover the city, but they don't do it in, with as much detail as they used to, so.
Any more questions?
You brought up that, I used to, when I was interning, or technically a gopher, I've been to that mob place to pick up sandwiches, but Steve Dunleavy is who sticks out the most for me. He was like out of central casting.
Oh, yeah.
Because if I worked in the day, if he worked at night, he would come in late and he was drunk. And I remember working in the day and he'd walk in and he'd be drunk. And he had, you know, the hair, he was always walking fast. He'd go into his office, he'd take his shirt off.
He didn't drive, right?
He was unbelievable.
He wasn't able to drive, right?
Yeah. And that was a character.
Yeah.
That was, when you thought newspapers and Australians and Fleet Street, I thought Steve Dunleavy, he was, you know, to be young and be working in a place like that, to me it was unbelievable. And every day it was funny.
There are some great,
But he had no respect for women, though.
No, well, that was definitely the culture in the
There were
office.
three, Barbara Ross, who's an amazing reporter, she left around the same time I did, and she went to the Daily News, and she owned the Parking Violations Bureau scandal. She broke one story after another, and the Post could have had those stories, but Steve Dunleavy treated her
Yeah.
with so little respect, and he drove me out the door. I think he was so drunk, he was no longer able to run the city
Yeah.
desk, and he focused on Page 6. And I came in one day and there was this story, this is what I'm talking about, sometimes they were they knew what worked, but sometimes they didn't. There was a story about the Soviets as the lead, and like, I had stories killed before, but not pulled in the middle of the night, nobody called me, and this, I'm like, what the hell is this doing on Page 6? And I went into Roger Wood, the executive editor, and I knew what had happened, and he couldn't guarantee that it wouldn't happen again. I said, my name's on it, and so I just quit, which was really stupid without another job, but that's another story. Yeah, no, Steve was a great character, but if you were a woman, and there were exceptions, believe me, there were exceptions, but anyway, he was problematic.
Do you think that should be labeled as news or entertainment, given that they publish lies that are covered, political lies that are covered by freedom of speech and not by truth in advertising?
Well, there are a lot of things in the paper that are legitimate. That's, so, I mean, to label the whole paper entertainment wouldn't be fair to those sections that are legitimate. I mean, I see your point, but I'm not sure that would be quite right.
I just think it's dangerous when you put something like FEMA is diverting money.
It is dangerous, I'm not disagreeing.
and it's sort of the same, you know, the same conundrum with Fox News.
Right.
There are legitimate news people there. Sometimes it depends on the time of day. Prime time is obviously all what you're referring to.
Yeah, it's not just the Post, it's the media.
Well, speaking of entertainment, to me, one of the most enjoyable parts of reading the Post are the headlines. And I was always curious how the headlines are developed, because some of them are laugh out loud.
Well, they have, I think there's a group of people at the copy desk that, and a lot of them are working remotely now, but when they were in the office, it would be almost a game, who was gonna come up. There's one thing that just cracks me up whenever I read it. There were the Hasidic Jews in Williamsburg were gonna stop the marathon because they were so pissed off that their roads had not properly been paved, so they were gonna stand in the road. And so the headlines that they were bouncing around were Dukes of Hasid, Yidlock. These did not get in the paper, I'm not sure. But yeah, exactly. They really had a good time, and it would become almost a contest. And then several of the guys that wrote, and there were still some people doing headlines there. Milton Goldstein has been at the paper since the 70s. He's still there. So there are people that really know how to do it that are still at the Post. I mean, that one last week about Adams, grand theft.
Oh, that was brilliant.
That was fabulous.
For those of you who didn't see the great New York Times review on paper of Wreckage, it reminded me, I had long forgotten about the headline when Ike Turner died, and it was Ike beats Tina to death. Tasteless, but, you know.
I interviewed John Waters and he said that was his all-time favorite.
I'm sure.
Post, he likes, you know, there are things he doesn't like about the Post, but he likes the headlines, so.
Maybe one more question?
Can I tell a story about a headline? I worked at the Post, I worked on the city desk, and we had a story, it was Mike Pearl's story. It was an administrative judge who had a spanking fetish. And he had gotten a hold of a photo where the administrative judge, he's got a young lady over on his, bending over his lap, and it was a still photo, but the picture was of him giving a spanking to this young lady. And they had the photo, and originally they were gonna run the story on page 1, but they didn't have the headline, they didn't have the line. So it was like in front of me, all these editors are in a circle coming up with ideas of, and it was like in front of me, so I threw into the circle, how about spanker caught red-handed? And they all looked at each other, and they all looked at me, and they all looked at each other, and they all looked at me, and then all dispersed without saying a word, because that was the headline.
There you go. Anyone could, the right headline could come from, it didn't have to be specifically a headline writer.
Right, so I think we're out of time.
Yeah.
Thank you all
Thank you so much for
for
coming.
being here. It's a great book, and, it's really nice to have it in front of the fireplace. A lot of patience.
Thank you, Harvey, thank you, Susan, it was wonderful talk, thank you all for coming, there are plenty of books for sale, Susan's happy to sign, and we'll just pull up some chairs to make a little room for you, and come on up. Thank you. Thank you.
Go ahead.